At 22, Mercy Whitfield stood alone at the edge of everything she had ever known, a widow with no husband, no home, and no one left who claimed her. Her husband, brother, Aldous Whitfield, had ridden into their homestead with a signed deed in his fist and a sheriff at his side, and he told her plainly that the land had never been his to keep, that the law favored blood over marriage, and that she had until sundown to gather what she could carry. What she carried out of that house fit into a single trunk and a coin purse holding $4.20, the whole of her worldly fortune after 11 years of marriage and labor. She walked 3 miles into the town of Hollow Creek with that trunk dragging behind her, and there, nailed to a post outside the land office, she saw a notice for a parcel no one wanted, an old flooded gristmill on Cutter's Bend, abandoned these dozen years, its wheel rotted, its foundation half-drowned, being sold for whatever the county could get. She paid $3 for it, the last of her dignity folded into that transaction, and the clerk laughed not unkindly and told her she bought herself a swamp. She did not know, standing there with mud already soaking through her boots, that beneath that ruined mill floor lay something sealed away that would not only save her life but would, in time, restore an entire town that had forgotten how to hope. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Whitfield. If you have ever felt cast aside by the very people who should have stood beside you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Mercy had been born Mercy Doyle, the third of 6 children on a hardscrabble farm outside Providence Junction, Ohio, in a household where nothing was wasted and everything was mended twice before it was thrown away. Her father, Samuel Doyle, was a miller by trade before the drought years turned him toward whatever work would feed his family, and it was from him that Mercy learned the language of grain and water and stone, the patient mechanics of a mill wheel turning, the way a millstone's dressing determined whether flour came out silken or coarse. She used to sit on an overturned bucket as a girl and watch her father work, memorizing the rhythm of the machinery the way other children memorize hymns. Her mother, Ruth, taught her something equally enduring. That value was rarely obvious to the careless eye, that a bruised apple could still make the sweetest sauce, that cracked bowl mended with care held soup just as well as a whole one. Nothing broken stays broken forever. Mercy, her mother used to say, unless you decide it does. These were not idle sayings in the Doyle household. They were survival, spoken by people who had learned to see where others saw only ruin. When Mercy was 19, she married Thomas Whitfield, a quiet, steady man with callous hands and a gentleness that surprised people who only saw his size. Thomas had inherited 40 acres near Hollow Creek from his father, a modest but workable homestead with good bottomland, and he and Mercy built a life there together with the same patient care her parent had shown her. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and their marriage, though it produced no children, was full of a quiet companionship that Mercy treasured more than she ever said aloud. She learned the rhythms of that land as she had once learned her father's mill, the way the creek rose and fell with the seasons, which fields drained well and which stayed sodden, how to preserve a harvest against a hard winter. She kept accounts, mended fences, doctored sick animals, and in the evening she and Thomas would sit on the porch and speak of small ambitions, a larger barn, a second well, someday perhaps a child. Thomas's younger brother, Aldous, visited rarely, and when he did, Mercy always sensed in him a hunger that unsettled her, a way of looking at Thomas's land as though calculating its worth rather than admiring its beauty. Thomas dismissed her unease gently, insisting his brother was simply restless, chasing schemes in Cincinnati that never quite paid off. Mercy did not argue, but she remembered, in the way a person remembers a splinter long after it has been removed, that something in Aldous's eyes had never sat right with her. The fall came suddenly, the way such things often do, dressed in the ordinary clothes of a Tuesday morning. Thomas had gone out before dawn to mend a section of fence along the northern boundary where cattle kept wandering onto a neighbor's land, and by midday, when he had not returned for his meal, Mercy went looking and found him collapsed beneath the fence line, his heart having simply stopped, the doctor said later, from causes no one could have predicted or prevented. She buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the creek he had loved, and for 3 months she managed a homestead alone with a grief so heavy it sometimes kept her from rising before noon, though rise she always did, because the animals needed tending and the land did not wait for morning. It was in the 4th month that Aldous arrived, not with condolences but with a lawyer and a deed, insisting that Thomas had died without a will, that under the laws of the state the land passed to his nearest blood relation, and that Mercy, as a widow with no children, had no legal claim to keep it. Mercy fought this as best she could, traveling to the county seat, speaking to a sympathetic but powerless clerk, learning that Aldis's claim, however cruel, was not without legal footing, especially once he produced witnesses willing to swear Thomas had spoken of leaving the land to his brother. Whether this was true or fabricated, Mercy never knew for certain, though she suspected the latter, and she carried that suspicion like a stone in her chest as she was made to leave the only home her marriage had built. She arrived in Hollow Creek proper with her trunk and her $4.20, and she took a room for one night at the boarding house run by a widow named Opal Fenn, a stout, sharp-eyed woman who fed her a bowl of stew without being asked and did not press her with questions she could see Mercy was too raw to answer. It was the next morning, walking toward the land office to inquire whether there was any work to be found in town, that Mercy passed a notice board and saw the parcel listed for the old Cutter's Bend mill. She had grown up around mills. She knew what a working one could someday become, and even ruined, even flooded. There was something in the sight of that listing that steadied her, some old instinct from her father's world reasserting itself. The clerk, a narrow, weary man named Corwin Ames, told her the mill had belonged to a man named Elias Pruitt, who had built it some 30 years prior and died without heirs anyone had ever located. The county had held the land in limbo for over a decade, unable to sell because no one wanted a flooded ruin with a broken wheel and a foundation half sunk in mud from a creek that had shifted its course. $3, Ames said, and it's yours, though I'll tell you plain, Mrs., you get more use out of burning that money for warmth. Mercy paid it anyway, because $3 for land, any land, however ruined, was still more than she would have for anything else, and because some quiet, stubborn part of her refused to arrive in a new town with absolutely nothing to her name. She walked out to Cutter's Bend that same afternoon, following a rutted track that grew faint to the farther it went, until the mill came into view above the tree line, a hulking wooden structure gone gray with weather, its great wheel cracked and still, half the building's foundation standing in stagnant water where the creek had long ago carved itself a new channel around the old mill race. It was, as the clerk promised, a ruin, but Mercy walked the perimeter with her father's eyes, noting that the timber frame, though weathered, was largely sound, that the stonework of the foundation on the dry side was solid granite, well laid, the kind of work that suggested Elias Pruitt had built to last even if the creek had not cooperated. Inside, the mill floor was thick with dust and old leaves blown in through a broken window, the grinding stones still sitting in their housing, rusted gears frozen in place. It was while she was pacing the floor, testing boards to rut the way her father had taught her, that she noticed one section near the northeast corner sounded different beneath her boot heel, a hollow knock instead of the solid thud of the rest of the flooring. She knelt, brushing away dust and mouse droppings, and found that 4 boards had been cut and fitted with precision that had nothing to do with ordinary millwork, their edges beveled to sit flush and nearly invisible unless a person was looking or listening for exactly what she had just heard. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a rusted pry bar she found among the mill's abandoned tools, to lift those boards free, and beneath them she found not the emptiness she half expected, but a shallow chamber lined with tin to keep out damp, and within that chamber a wooden box, iron-strapped and padlocked, along with a bundle of oilcloth wrap papers that had survived remarkably well in their sealed hiding place. The padlock was old but not impossible, and using a stone from the mill's own foundation, Mercy broke it open to find the box contained coins, not a fortune by the standards of a wealthy man, but a genuine sum for a woman who owned nothing, gold and silver totaling some $300, along with a man's pocket watch and a wedding ring far too small for a man's hand. The oilcloth papers proved to be letters in a kind of ledger, written in a careful, aging hand. And as Mercy sat on that dusty mill floor reading by the light through the broken window, she began to understand that Elias Pruitt had not died alone and without heirs as the county believed, but had once had a wife, a woman named Sarah, and a daughter, and that something had happened between them that the ledger only hinted at with the pained economy of a man unwilling to fully commit his shame. To paper, the letters told a fractured story, the kind that come together slowly like a quilt piece from mismatched scraps. Elias Pruitt had built the mill in partnership with his wife's brother, a man named Josiah Rourke, and for some years the business had thrived, the mill serving the whole valley, its flour prize as far as the county seat. But a flood in the mill's 10th year had damaged the wheel and washed away a season's stored grain, and in the desperate months that followed, Josiah had apparently convinced Elias to take a loan against the mill from a Cincinnati banker, a loan that Josiah then used, according to Elias's own bitter account, to quietly siphon funds into speculative land deals that failed, leaving the mill's debt unpaid and the bank threatening seizure. Sarah, Elias's wife, had sided with her brother in the dispute that followed, believing Elias had mismanaged the mill's affairs and driven Josiah to desperation rather than the reverse, and the marriage had fractured under the weight of it. Sarah had taken their daughter and left for her mother's family in Kentucky, and Elias, unwilling to let the bank simply claim the coins he had managed to save by then, had hidden that box beneath the very floorboards Mercy now knelt upon, intending, the last letter said, to bring it to Sarah once he had cleared his name and repaired what could be repaired. He never got the chance. A second entry, written in a different, later hand that Mercy recognized as belonging to a neighbor named Hiram Cutler who had apparently helped nurse Elias in his final illness, recorded that Elias had died of a fever before he could make that journey, taking the secret of the hidden coins to what everyone assumed was simply an empty, forgotten grave. Mercy sat with this discovery for a long while, the fading light slanting through the mill's broken window, and she felt the peculiar weight of holding a dead man's unfinished sorrow in her hands. She was not, by nature, a woman inclined toward greed, but she was also a woman who had just been stripped of everything she owned by a scheming relative, and the temptation to simply take the coins and vanish somewhere new must be acknowledged honestly, for Mercy herself acknowledged it in the quiet of that evening. Yet even as she counted the coins into neat stacks by candlelight back at Opal Fenn's boarding house, her mother's old words returned to her. Nothing broken stays broken forever unless you decide it does, and she began to understand that the true fortune hidden in that mill was not merely the gold but the chance to finish what Elias Pruitt had never managed to finish, to set right a wrong that had broken not just a marriage but, as she would soon learn, a whole community's trust. The following weeks, Mercy made careful, deliberate inquiries around Hollow Creek, learning that the mill's collapse decades earlier had, in fact, devastated the surrounding farms, which had relied upon it for grinding their grain into flour they could sell or trade. Without it, families had been forced to haul their harvest nearly 20 miles to the nearest working mill, a burden that had driven several farms into ruin and had, over the years, thinned Hollow Creek's population as families gave up and moved on. She learned, too, from Opal Fenn's talkative boarders, that Josiah Rourke's descendants still lived in the area under a different surname, having married into the prominent Ashworth family, and that the current patriarch of that family, a hard, calculating man named Reuben Ashworth, held considerable influence in the town, sitting on the very county board that had, years ago, quietly let the Pruitt Mill's ownership lapse into unclaimed limbo rather than investigate its history too closely. Mercy began to suspect, and later confirmed through old county records Colin Ames helped her locate, that Reuben's father, Josiah himself, had used his political connections to ensure no one looked too hard into what had happened to the mill's debts or its missing owner's fortune, content to let the ruin rot in obscurity rather than risk the truth surfacing. When Mercy announced, over the following month, her intention to rebuild the mill using the money she had found, funding not only new machinery but offering to grind grain for local farmers at rates far below what they currently paid to travel elsewhere, Reuben Ashworth's opposition was swift and thinly disguised as civic concern. He argued before the county board that the mill's ownership was clouded, that a woman alone had no business operating heavy machinery, that the old flood danger made the site unsafe, and he quietly pressured the bank that held influence over new business permits to delay and complicate Mercy's applications at every turn. Mercy understood, with growing clarity, that Reuben's resistance had less to do with genuine concern and everything to do with fear that a rebuilt mill and the records within it might finally expose his father's old theft and the true reason the Pruitt family had been destroyed. She did not confront him directly, not yet, choosing instead to do what her father had taught her, to work quietly and let competence speak where accusations might only be dismissed. She hired Hiram Cutler's grandson, a young carpenter named Walt, to help assess and begin repairing the mill structure, and she used a portion of the coins to purchase new grinding stones and repair the wheel, working alongside Walt through long days that left her hands blistered and her back aching in a way that felt, strangely, like healing. The conflict came to a head at a county meeting called to review Mercy's business permit, where Reuben Ashworth stood before the assembled townspeople and declared, with practiced sorrow, that he had reason to believe the mill's supposed treasure had been stolen from its rightful heirs, hinting darkly that Mercy's claim to the coins was itself suspect, perhaps even criminal. It was in this moment that Mercy produced the oilcloth letters, reading aloud, in a voice that did not shake though her hands trembled slightly, Elias Pruitt's own account of Josiah Rourke's betrayal, the diverted loan, the ruined harvest, the broken marriage that had scattered a family and left a good man to die alone believing himself dishing it. The room fell silent in the particular way rooms fall silent when a long-buried truth finally surfaces, and several older residents, people who remembered the mill's collapse and the Pruitt family's disappearance, began murmuring that they had always wondered, always suspected something had never added up about how quickly the Ashworth family's fortunes had risen just as the mill fell. Reuben blustered and threatened legal action, but Corwin Ames, standing quietly at the back of the room, confirmed that the county records Mercy had located matched dates and figures precisely, and that the loan documents, still on file in the county archive, bore Josiah Rourke's signature disbursing funds that never once touched the mill's actual debts. Mercy did not seek to punish Reuben Ashworth through the law, though she would have had ground to try. Instead, she made a choice that surprised the entire town and, in its way, delivered a justice more complete than any courtroom might have provided. She announced that a portion of the recovered funds, beyond what was needed to finish the mill's repairs, would be set aside to help any family in the valley struggling to pay old debts tied, directly or indirectly, to the years the mill had stood idle, a quiet acknowledgement that the whole community had suffered from Josiah Rourke's theft, not merely the Pruitt family alone. She also wrote, with Opal Fenn's help finding the address, to Sarah Pruitt's descendants in Kentucky, having traced through the letters that Sarah had eventually remarried but that her daughter, now an elderly woman named Constance, was still living. And Mercy sent word of what had been found, along with an invitation to visit Hollow Creek and see the mill her grandfather had built restored to working order, and a portion of the gold set aside in trust for her, the rightful, if long forgotten, Reuben Ashworth, stripped of the town's trust and facing the quiet, withering judgment of neighbors who now understood the true source of his family's old prosperity, resigned his seat on the county board within the month and largely withdrew from public life, his punishment not imprisonment but something perhaps more fitting, the slow, permanent erosion of the respect he had spent decades cultivating on a foundation of stolen grain and broken families. The mill reopened on a bright autumn morning nearly a year after Mercy had first paid her $3 for what everyone believed was worthless ruin, its will turning smoothly in Cutter's Bend's restored current, farmers arriving from every corner of the valley with wagons of grain, many of them weeping openly at the sound of the grinding stones working again after so many silent years. Constance, Elias and Sarah's daughter, did travel from Kentucky that first winter, an elderly woman who walked the mill floor with tears in her eyes, laying her hand on the very board beneath which her father's hidden hope had waited for over 3 decades, and she insisted, over Mercy's protests, that Mercy keep the mill entirely as her own, saying that her father would have wanted nothing more than to see his life's work finally serve the purpose he had always intended, in the hands of someone who understood, as he had, that a mill was not merely machinery but the beating heart of a community's survival. We began this story by telling you that Mercy Whitfield was widowed at 22, cast off with nothing but $4.20, and that she paid 3 of those dollars for a flooded, forgotten grain mill that everyone else believed was worthless. We told you a false flaw that had a buried secret, and now you understand it had far more than gold. It had the unfinished grief of a broken family, the quiet theft that had impoverished an entire valley, and the chance for one overlooked woman to become the instrument of a restoration no one, least of all Mercy herself, could have predicted on the day she stood muddy and grieving outside that land office. She did not rebuild the mill to punish Reuben Ashworth, though justice found him regardless. She rebuilt it because she recognized, in Elias Pruitt's careful, sorrowful letters, the same conviction her own mother had instilled in her long ago in a farmhouse kitchen in Ohio, that nothing broken stays broken forever unless someone decides it does. Mercy Whitfield decided otherwise, for a ruined mill, for a fractured town, and, in the quiet turning of that restored wheel each morning, for herself as well, a widow who had arrived in Hollow Creek with nothing and became, in time, the woman the whole valley depended upon. Thank you for spending this time with Mercy's story and with us. If it moved you, we hope you will consider sharing it with someone who might need reminding tonight that what looks broken or worthless to the world is not always broken or worthless at all. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Your stories are what make this small corner of the internet feel like a real gathering place, and we read every one of them. Until next time, stay close.